After my son-in-law's funeral, we sat down for what should have been a simple family conversation about my daughter's future. My son-in-law's mother leaned across my own dining table, smiled like she was doing me a favor, and said, "The boy stays with us now. You're too old to raise him, and frankly, you never had any real say in this family." I just nodded and thanked her for her concern. But 3 weeks later, when my late wife's private investigator finally called me back, everything Marjorie Hensley thought she owned came crashing down. Before I go any further, let me ask you something. If you've ever been underestimated by in-laws who thought your quiet manners meant weakness, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you've ever had to fight quietly, patiently, for a grandchild you loved more than your own life, hit that like button for me, because this one's for you. My name is Walter. I'm 58 years old, and for most of my adult life, I ran a small but respected furniture restoration business out of a converted barn in western Pennsylvania. Nothing glamorous. I fixed up antique dressers, rebuilt old rocking chairs, refinished dining sets that families had passed down for generations. My wife, Carol, was the one with the real vision. She was the one who found the pieces at estate sales, who saw beauty in something everyone else had written off as garbage. We built that business together for almost 30 years, and we built something even more important alongside it, our daughter, Emily. Emily was our only child, and she was the best of both of us. She had Carol's sharp eye for beauty and my patience for slow, careful work. She grew up in that barn workshop, sanding down table legs before she was tall enough to see over the workbench. When she met a young man named Trevor Hensley at a community college pottery class, I liked him immediately. He was quiet, a little awkward, but he had gentle hands, and he looked at my daughter like she'd hung the moon. They married. Young Emily was 24. Trevor was 26, and within 2 years they gave us the greatest gift of our lives, a grandson named Sam. Carol passed away from a stroke when Sam was 4. It was sudden, no warning, no goodbye. One morning she was laughing at something on the radio while she made coffee, and by that evening she was gone. I won't pretend I've ever fully recovered from that. Some losses don't heal, they just get quieter over time. But I had Emily, and I had little Sam, and for a while, that was enough to keep me standing upright. What I didn't know back then, what none of us knew, was that Trevor's mother, Marjorie, had never actually approved of Emily. Marjorie Hensley came from what she liked to call old money, though anyone who actually looked closely would have seen that most of that money had dried up 2 generations before she was born. She still wore the pearls and used the tone of voice, but the Hensley family fortune was mostly memory and mortgage debt by the time Trevor was grown. Marjorie needed her son to marry well. Instead, he married the daughter of a furniture restorer and a paralegal, and Marjorie never let anyone forget it. For years, Marjorie's contempt stayed mostly beneath the surface, a comment here, a cold shoulder there, always delivered with a smile so nobody could call her out on it directly. She'd tell Emily her hair looked so practical for a family photo. She'd ask me, in front of guests, whether I'd ever considered a real trade instead of fixing up other people's junk. Trevor never defended his wife or his father-in-law. He'd just shift in his seat, mumble something about his mother, meaning well, and change the subject. I told myself it wasn't my business to interfere in my daughter's marriage. I told myself Emily was strong enough to handle her mother-in-law on her own. I was wrong to stay quiet, but at the time, I thought silence was respect. Then, 8 months ago, Trevor was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. He was 32 years old. The diagnosis came fast, and the decline came faster. Within 6 months, my son-in-law, the gentle young man who used to make pottery mugs shaped like little animals for Sam's birthday, was gone. Emily was widowed at 30, left alone with a 7-year-old boy, and a grief so heavy I watched it physically bend her shoulders forward, like she was carrying something on her back that none of us could see. I moved into their guest room the week Trevor died. I told myself it was to help Emily with Sam, to cook meals, to drive Sam to school when Emily couldn't get out of bed. That was true. But there was another reason I moved in, one I didn't fully admit to myself until later. I didn't trust Marjorie Hensley, and I didn't want Emily and Sam alone in a house she could walk into whenever she pleased. Marjorie showed up at the hospital during Trevor's final days, wearing a black Chanel suit, as if she'd been preparing for the funeral before her son had even passed. She barely looked at Emily. She spent most of her visits talking to the doctors about the estate and the timeline, as if Trevor's death were a business transaction she needed to expedite. I remember one afternoon, Emily was in the hallway crying into her hands, and Marjorie walked right past her to ask a nurse whether Trevor's life insurance paperwork had been finalized. I never told Emily what I overheard that day. I didn't want to add one more wound to a woman already bleeding from 100 of them. At the funeral, Marjorie stood at the front of the church in a wide-brimmed black hat, accepting condolences like a queen receiving her court. She gave a eulogy about Trevor's childhood, his piano lessons, his prep school days. She spoke for 11 minutes and never once mentioned Emily's name and never once mentioned Sam. When she finally sat down, she leaned over to me and whispered, loud enough for the people around us to hear, "Well, Walter, I suppose you'll finally have some peace and quiet now that you don't have to keep pretending my son married up." I said nothing. Emily's hand found mine under the pew, shaking. I squeezed it and stayed silent, because I did not want to give Marjorie the satisfaction of watching me lose my composure at my son-in-law's funeral. 3 days after we buried Trevor, Marjorie called and asked to come by to discuss the family's future. I should have known then that this wasn't going to be a condolence visit. I offered her coffee. She declined, sat down in Carol's old armchair without asking, and got straight to business. She told Emily that she had spoken with her own attorney and that given the circumstances, it would be best for everyone if Sam came to live with her and her second husband, Richard, at their estate outside of Pittsburgh. She said Emily was clearly overwhelmed, that grief had made her unfit to provide stability, and that a boy needed proper structure during a formative time, the kind of structure, she implied without saying it directly, that a widow living off a small furniture business income simply couldn't provide. Emily was too stunned to speak. I watched my daughter's face go pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound, the way a person looks when the floor has just vanished beneath their feet. That's when Marjorie turned to me, smiled that same closed-mouth smile she'd worn at the funeral, and said the words that I will never forget as long as I live. "The boy stays with us now. You're too old to raise him, and frankly, you never had any real say in this family." I looked at her for a long moment. And then, God help me, I smiled back, and I thanked her for her concern, and I told her we would think carefully about what she'd said. Emily looked at me like I'd betrayed her. I understood that look. I felt it too. But I had learned something in 58 years of life that Marjorie Hensley, for all her money and her pearls, had never learned. You do not show your hand to a predator while she's still circling. You wait, you watch, and you let her believe she's already won. After Marjorie left that evening, Emily broke down completely. She asked me how I could have just sat there and thanked that woman for threatening to take her son. I held my daughter while she cried, and I told her the truth that I was angrier in that moment than I had ever been in my entire life. Angrier than I had words for, but that anger displayed too early is just a warning shot, and warning shots let your enemy prepare. I told her that her mother would never have wanted us to fight Marjorie Hensley with tears and shouting. Carol would have wanted us to fight her the way Carol fought everything quietly, patiently, and with better information than the other side had. That night, once Emily and Sam were finally asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee going cold in front of me, and I thought about Carol. My wife had never trusted Marjorie either. In the last year of her life, Carol had mentioned to me, almost in passing, that she thought there was something off about how quickly Marjorie had pushed Trevor and Emily towards signing a prenuptial agreement that gave Marjorie's family trust unusual control over any property Trevor might inherit or acquire during the marriage, including, buried in dense legal language neither Trevor nor Emily had fully understood at 24 years old, language about minor dependents of the marriage that I hadn't thought twice about until that night at the kitchen table. I went up to the small home office Carol used to keep her paralegal files organized. Files I hadn't touched since she passed because it hurt too much to go through them. I hadn't been able to face that room in 4 years. But that night, I finally opened the bottom drawer of her old oak filing cabinet, and I found something I didn't know existed. A thin manila folder labeled, in Carol's careful handwriting, Hensley Personal. Inside was a business card for a private investigator named Ronald Petrosky, along with a handwritten note dated almost 5 years earlier, shortly after Trevor and Emily's engagement. Carol had written, "Marjorie pushing the prenup too hard, too fast. Something about the trust language doesn't add up. Asked Ron to look into the family finances quietly. Don't want to worry unless it matters." My hands were shaking as I read it. Carol had suspected something was wrong with Marjorie Hensley's family finances years before any of us knew Trevor would get sick. years before any of this custody threat ever surfaced. She had quietly hired an investigator to look into it, and then I could only guess the demands of the business, or simply the chaos of daily life, had pulled her attention elsewhere before she ever followed up. She died with that thread still hanging, unfinished, tucked away in a drawer I hadn't opened in 4 years. I called the number on the business card at 8 o'clock the next morning. Ronald Petrosky picked up on the second ring, and when I explained who I was and mentioned Carol's name, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. He told me he remembered the case well. It was one he'd never officially closed, because his final report had never been delivered. He said Carol had called him only 2 weeks before her stroke to check on his progress, and then he'd simply never heard from her again. And out of respect, once he found out what happened, he hadn't pushed the matter with a grieving family he'd never even met in person. I asked him what he'd found. He told me it would be better to discuss it in person, and that I should bring the folder. We set a meeting for 3 days later at his office in Pittsburgh. Those 3 days were some of the hardest of my life, because I had to sit across the table from Emily and Sam every evening, playing the role of the tired old grandfather who had simply thanked Marjorie and let the matter drop. While inside, I was holding onto a thread that might unravel everything. Emily barely spoke to me during that time. She was hurt that I hadn't fought back harder in the moment, and I understood that hurt, but I couldn't explain myself yet without risking everything before I had the full picture. Marjorie, meanwhile, moved fast. 2 days after her visit, she had her attorney send a formal letter proposing a temporary custody arrangement for Sam, citing Emily's documented emotional instability. Following Trevor's death, as if grieving your husband of 6 years made you an unfit mother. She scheduled a follow-up meeting at my house for the following Saturday, where she said her attorney would walk us through the paperwork so we could avoid the unnecessary stress and expense of family court. She was giving us exactly 1 week. I recognized the tactic immediately because I had seen it before in every predatory contract Carol used to warn our furniture clients about move fast, use official-sounding language, and make the target feel like resistance is more trouble than it's worth. On the day of my meeting with Ronald Petrosky, I drove into Pittsburgh with Carol's folder on the passenger seat like it was something sacred. Ronald's office was small, cluttered with case files, nothing like the sleek downtown law offices I imagined Marjorie's people occupied. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with tired eyes and a gentle, direct way of speaking that reminded me of Carol's own careful precision. He laid out what he'd found 5 years earlier, information he'd apparently kept because something about the case had bothered him enough that he never fully let it go. Marjorie Hensley's family trust, the one whose language had been quietly written into Trevor and Emily's prenuptial agreement, was not the generational old money fortune Marjorie presented to the world. In reality, the trust had been almost entirely depleted 15 years earlier, largely due to bad investments made by Marjorie's first husband, Trevor's father, before he died. What kept the Hensley lifestyle afloat since then was something far less glamorous. Marjorie's second husband, Richard, had quietly been the sole financial engine of the household for over a decade, and Richard's own considerable estate, not the Hensley name, not any old family trust, was where the real money lived. Here was the detail that made my blood run cold. Buried in the prenuptial agreement's trust language, which Ronald had reviewed in detail, was a clause stating that if Trevor predeceased his wife and left behind a minor child, guardianship arrangements for that child would trigger specific distribution rights connecting to Richard's estate plan, not the depleted Hensley trust everyone assumed was in play, but Richard's actual fortune. In plain English, whoever had legal guardianship of Sam stood to gain significant influence, if not outright financial control, over how a substantial portion of Richard's estate would eventually be distributed, because Richard had named Sam, his only step-grandchild, as a primary beneficiary in his own will, likely as a genuine act of love toward a boy he'd known since infancy. Marjorie didn't want Sam because she was worried about Emily's parenting. Marjorie wanted Sam because whoever controlled Sam's guardianship controlled a direct line to Richard's money, and Richard, according to Ronald's more recent digging over the past week since I'd called him, had been diagnosed 6 months earlier with early-stage Parkinson's disease and had begun quietly revising his estate plan with increasing frequency. I sat in that cluttered little office and felt something shift inside me, the same thing I imagined Carol must have felt the moment she first grew suspicious 5 years earlier. This wasn't grief anymore. This wasn't even simple anger. It was clarity cold, focused clarity, The kind I used to feel restoring a piece of furniture that looked ruined beyond saving until you found the one hidden joint holding the whole structure together. I asked Ronald if he could get everything documented properly and verified within a week. He told me he could, but that the most important piece, proof of Marjorie's specific intentions regarding Sam and Richard's estate, would require something more than financial records. It would require catching her saying the quiet part out loud. I drove home that evening with a plan taking shape, one that I knew Carol would have approved of, because it was built on the same principle she taught me every single day of our marriage. Never confront a problem you don't fully understand yet, and never let your opponent see you working. For the next several days, I played my role carefully. I told Emily, gently, that I had a plan but that I needed her to trust me for just a little while longer without asking too many questions, because the fewer people who knew what I was doing, the safer Sam would be. Emily, God bless her, had inherited her mother's patience along with her mother's grief. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and told me she trusted me completely, even though I could see how badly it cost her to hold her questions in. I called my late wife's oldest friend, an attorney named Diane Castellano, who had worked alongside Carol for nearly 20 years before Carol left the firm to help me run the furniture business full-time. Diane had retired from active litigation, but still kept her license current, and when I explained the situation, she came out of retirement without hesitation. For Carol, she said simply, "I'll do anything." Diane and Ronald began working together, building a complete picture, the real state of the Hensley Trust, Richard's estate documents, and this was the piece that made everything click into place, records showing that Marjorie had, just 11 days after Trevor's diagnosis 8 months earlier, quietly opened a new joint account with her attorney as co-signer, an account she'd been slowly funneling money into from household funds that should have gone toward Richard's medical care, given his own declining condition. Marjorie wasn't just angling for guardianship of Sam to access Richard's future estate. She was also quietly draining what she could reach right now, positioning herself for a future where Richard, weakened by Parkinson's, would need increasing care that she alone would control, and where Sam's guardianship would give her a second, larger claim to make when Richard eventually passed. I asked Diane the same question I'd asked Ronald. How do we prove intention, not just financial suspicion? Diane suggested something I would never have thought of myself. She had a contact who did discreet, fully legal audio documentation for exactly these kinds of family custody and elder financial abuse cases. Recording devices worn openly enough to be legally admissible under Pennsylvania's consent laws, which only require one party in the conversation to know they're being recorded. Diane suggested that at Marjorie's planned Saturday meeting, I should be the one wearing it. The Saturday meeting arrived. Marjorie showed up at my house at exactly 10 in the morning, punctual as a debt collector, trailing her attorney, a sharp young man named Bradley Coons who carried a leather folio thick with paperwork. Richard was not with her, Marjorie mentioned, almost too casually, that Richard hasn't been feeling well lately, and I noted the flicker of impatience in her voice, as if her husband's declining health was simply an inconvenience, delaying her plans rather than a man she claimed to love. I let them into my living room. Emily sat beside me, tense as a coiled spring, exactly as we'd rehearsed. Sam was at a friend's house for the day, safely out of the way. I wore a plain gray cardigan that morning, the kind Carol used to say made me look like everybody's favorite grandfather. Sewn discreetly into the inner seam, beneath a button, was the small recording device Diane's contact had provided. Marjorie sat down in Carol's old armchair again. I let her this time on purpose, and Bradley Coons began laying out the guardianship paperwork with the same rapid, jargon-heavy delivery I imagine he used to overwhelm every grieving, confused family he'd ever cornered. He spoke about the child's best interests and stability metrics and voluntary transfer to avoid protracted litigation. Each phrase designed to make resistance sound both unreasonable and expensive. Marjorie interrupted him to deliver her real message directly to Emily. She said that Emily's erratic emotional state since Trevor's death made her unsuitable to raise a 7-year-old during such a critical developmental window, and that any responsible mother would recognize that Sam deserved the stability and resources that only the Hensley household could provide. She reached over and patted my hand, condescending and cold, and told me that surely, at my age, I understood the wisdom of not overextending myself with a young child underfoot. I let her talk. I let her build her entire case, exactly as I had planned. Exactly the way I had once watched a difficult customer talk himself into revealing his real budget by simply staying quiet and letting silence do the work silence always does. Marjorie, feeling emboldened by our apparent passivity, kept going. And then she made the mistake I had been waiting for. She turned to her attorney and said, with obvious irritation, that they needed to move faster on the paperwork because Richard's condition is deteriorating quicker than the doctors first said, and that once guardianship was formalized, she wanted her attorney to immediately begin restructuring the estate language to reflect the new custodial arrangement, so that there's no ambiguity about who's managing Sam's inheritance going forward. Bradley Coons, to his credit, looked briefly uncomfortable at how openly she'd said this in front of us. Marjorie didn't seem to notice or care. I set my coffee cup down on its saucer, and I asked her, very calmly, whether by Sam's inheritance she meant Richard's estate specifically. Marjorie, caught slightly off guard that I'd spoken up at all, said, "Well, of course, Walter. Richard adores that boy. It only makes sense that Sam's guardian would need to be closely involved in managing what Richard eventually leaves him, especially given Richard's health." I asked her one more question. I asked her whether Richard knew that she'd already opened a new account 11 days after Trevor's diagnosis, funded by household money that should have gone toward Richard's own medical care. The color drained from Marjorie's face so fast it was almost cruel to watch. Bradley Coons's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. Marjorie asked me, her voice suddenly sharp and thin, how I could possibly know anything about that account. I told her the truth. I told her that my late wife had suspected something wasn't right about the Hensley family finances 5 years ago, and had quietly begun looking into it before her death, and that I had simply finished the work she started. I told her that everything, the depleted trust, the prenuptial language connecting Sam's guardianship to Richard's estate, the new account opened 11 days after her own son's cancer diagnosis, had been thoroughly documented by a licensed investigator and a retired attorney, and that our conversation this very morning had just been legally recorded in full compliance with Pennsylvania law. Marjorie stood up so fast Carol's old armchair rocked backward against the wall. She said this was outrageous, that I had no right, that she would sue me for invasion of privacy, that I had no idea who I was dealing with. I told her, quietly, that I knew exactly who I was dealing with, a woman who had looked at her own son's death and immediately started calculating what she could gain from his orphan child, a woman who had been slowly draining her sick husband's finances while he was too weakened by Parkinson's to notice, and a woman who had just confirmed, on tape, that guardianship of my grandson had never been about Sam's well-being at all. Bradley Coons closed his leather folio without being asked. He looked at Marjorie, then at me, and said, in the flat professional tone of a man calculating his own exposure, that given what he'd just heard regarding the account discrepancies, he needed to strongly advise his client against making any further statements without additional counsel present, and that he personally could not, in good conscience, continue advising on a guardianship petition built on the foundation he just watched crumble in front of him. He gathered his things and left without another word, leaving Marjorie standing alone in my living room. Marjorie tried one final card. She turned to Emily, her voice dropping into something almost pleading, and said that none of this had to matter, that we could still resolve this quietly, that she was simply trying to protect Sam's future the way any grandmother would. Emily, who had stayed silent and controlled through the entire meeting exactly as we'd planned, finally spoke. She told Marjorie that she had watched her stand at Trevor's funeral and talk about piano lessons for 11 minutes without once saying her grandson's name, and that a woman who couldn't be bothered to mention Sam while burying his father had no business claiming she wanted to protect his future now. She told Marjorie that Trevor deserved better than a mother who saw his death as an opportunity, and that Sam deserved better than a grandmother who saw him as a line item in someone else's estate. Marjorie left my house that morning without her attorney, without her guardianship paperwork, and without a single word in response, because for the first time in this entire ordeal, she genuinely had nothing left to say. The following weeks unfolded quickly. Diane helped us formally notify Richard's own estate attorney of what we documented, not out of vindictiveness, but because Richard, a man neither Emily nor I had ever had a reason to distrust, deserved to know the truth about where his money had been going, while Parkinson slowly eroded his ability to keep track of his own finances. Richard, it turned out, was devastated. He'd had no idea about the new account, No idea Marjorie had been positioning herself around his declining health, and within a month, quietly and with great sadness, he filed for separation and restructured his entire estate plan with the help of his own independent attorney, ensuring that Sam remained a beneficiary, but that all guardianship-linked language was permanently removed and that Marjorie's access to any of it was severed entirely. Marjorie never faced criminal charges. Diane explained that what she'd done sat in a difficult gray area of marital finance law. Since technically the money had come from a joint household account she was legally entitled to access, even if the intent behind it was rotten to the core. But she lost everything that mattered to her image: her marriage, her access to Richard's fortune, and, most damning, in the small, gossip-hungry social circles she'd spent her whole life cultivating: her reputation. Word travels fast in those circles. Once a story like this starts moving, and within 6 months, Marjorie Hensley had quietly relocated to a smaller condo 2 states away, estranged from nearly everyone who once accepted her invitations. Emily filed and received full, uncontested legal custody of Sam within weeks, with the guardianship threat permanently dissolved. She went back to school part-time, something she'd put on hold when she married young, and slowly, carefully, began rebuilding a life that was entirely her own, not defined by grief or by the shadow of a mother-in-law who'd never respected her. I moved out of the guest room about 8 months after that Saturday meeting. Once Emily told me, gently but firmly, that she was ready to stand on her own 2 feet again. I didn't go far, just back to my own house 15 minutes away, and I still show up every Thursday evening to help Sam with his homework at the same kitchen table where his grandmother Carol once traced her suspicions about the Hensley Trust into the margins of a manila folder. Sam is 9 now. He still doesn't fully understand everything that happened that year, and I don't think he needs to, not yet. What he does know is that his father loved him, that his mother fought for him, and that his grandfather never once let anyone push their family around, even when it looked, from the outside, like I'd simply rolled over and said thank you. I think about Carol almost every single day, but especially on Thursday evenings, watching Sam hunch over his math homework with the exact same look of concentration she used to have bent over a chipped antique dresser, finding the one small crack that told her everything about how the whole piece had been built. She used to tell me that you can't fix something you don't fully understand yet, that rushing repairs always just hides the damage instead of healing it. I didn't fully understand what she meant until the year I sat quietly across from a woman trying to steal my grandson, smiling and saying thank you, while I waited for the truth my wife had left behind to finally set us all free. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that dignity and patience are not the same thing as weakness, no matter how badly certain people want you to believe they are. The people who mistake your silence for surrender are usually the ones who end up most surprised when that silence turns out to have been strategy all along. I hope wherever you're listening from tonight, you never have to face what my family faced. But if you do, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do for the people you love is simply wait, watch closely, and trust that the truth, given enough time, always finds its way home.